Hello, my name's Susie Fraser. I am Director of Manchester Communication Research School, and this pre-recorded webinar is intended to provide brief updates on the research evidence that has been released from the Education Endowment Foundation in recent months. We are going to start with the most recent guidance report, which is the deployment of teaching assistants, which was released in March. You are probably familiar with the previous guidance report, making best use of teaching assistants. And this new version, there'll be lots of familiarity and similarities between the two guidance reports. What's different in this guidance report is that kind of focus on leadership and deployment and implementation as well. It also includes lots of exemplification in line with other recent guidance reports, lots of ideas on how to be practical, how to approach this in schools. So that's the kind of main changes and the reason for the update, really. What also is really interesting is the process that was undertaken in order to arrive at the guidance report. And this is what's called an evidence to decision framework. And this is a structured and systematic approach used in evidence-based decision making to ensure that decisions are transparent, consistent, and based on the best available evidence. So this includes the certainty of the evidence, how important the problem is in that the recommendations are addressing, and the benefits and any harms of any recommendations, cost, feasibility of implementing. So it considers a range of factors about the usability and how well it can be applied and implemented in schools. So here, the Education Endowment Foundation can be, as part of this process, can be really transparent in why these recommendations are here and why it's worded in this way and what the link is to the evidence base. It's also important to say that there is involvement of a panel through this process as well. So where the evidence wasn't very clear, then the panel was consulted, and their input has been relied on at different stages to ensure that the wording is appropriate, that the formatting of the recommendation is suitable, and considering why that is important. So that's really key to this report. So here are the recommendations that are part of that guidance report. You'll notice that that's split into two separate areas. The first three recommendations being linked to practice, and the final two recommendations being considered around implementation. You'll notice, if you're familiar with the previous guidance report, that those practices are very similar, that the TAs are there to supplement and support high quality first teaching, that there are strategies that teaching assistants can use that can support students' independence, moving more towards independence, and not having a kind of reliability and dependency on a teaching assistant. And then there's that recommendation around interventions and making sure that where teaching assistants are used to deliver interventions, that they are evidence-based interventions and that the teaching assistants are supported and trained appropriately to deliver those in line with the evidence base. The final two recommendations there around implementation, and that's about ensuring that there is that shared understanding of how teaching assistants are used in your school, that there is that communication between teachers and teaching assistants, and make sure that staff, all teachers and TAs, are well trained in how to deploy teaching assistants most effectively in the classroom. The other really useful part of this guidance report are some of the supporting resources. So firstly, there is this scaffolding framework, which is about that movement towards independence and removing that reliability and dependence on a teaching assistant. So you can see there how a teaching assistant can move from correcting to supporting a student to be self-scaffolding. And there's those explanations there about what we mean at those different stages. Again, a really useful resource for any professional development or coaching of TAs. And this also supports with that as well. So for each of those different points on that scaffolding triangle or pyramid, then you can see ways in which the teaching assistant can enact that in the classroom through visual scaffolds, through verbal scaffolds, and through written scaffolds. So really, really helpful resources that can form part of a training programme could be a visual prompt for teaching assistants. That's something that we're considering at my school. How can we bring these resources to life with some prompts that teaching assistants can have with them and use as their own checkpoint and checklist when they're in a classroom and working with students. Moving on then to another piece of another resource that's been released this year, and that's the guidance around the early years pupil premium. We know the importance of early years education, and we know that that gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged pupils starts in the early years. So this guidance and the pupil premium is intended to narrow those learning gaps at the earliest possible stage so that children are school ready and we can mitigate the impact of that disadvantage as early as possible. So what you'll find in this guidance is the main message being around taking a balanced approach to the expenditure of the pupil premium and the strategy around that. So first of all, this developing quality practice, and that emphasises again the importance of professional development and the universal offer. What happens in early years provision for all pupils? That's that high quality practice that focuses on those learning goals. That might be around communication and language, around physical development, reading, phonics. The second part of that puzzle is around tailored personalised support, and that's about really identifying as early as possible the strengths for each individual child, but also any learning gaps that are emerging in those early stages, and then taking very personalised approaches on how to narrow them. What the research evidence tells us is that many of those approaches lead to improved approaches for all children, for many children as well. And then that final piece around lead, plan and sustain is about making and embedding changes to practice in the long term and considering that strategic approach. To support with that, there is also the Guide to Effective Professional Development in the Early Years. This isn't quite as recent anymore, but it will align with, if you're familiar with the effective professional development guidance for schools, it aligns with that in sense of the mechanism structure is the same, but it identifies some mechanisms, a fewer number of mechanisms that can be applied in early years settings and helps early years leaders to consider how professional development can be most effective in early years settings. It considers 4 areas, and that's around how to build knowledge of practitioners and educators, how to motivate practitioners, educators, teachers, how to develop teaching techniques, and how to embed practice. So again, if you're familiar with the Guide to Professional Development for schools and colleges, then you'll recognise that balanced design of those categories. A useful resource as part of this guidance is this Guide to Professional Development Conversations, recognising that in early years settings, because there are fewer staff that are early years experts, then often that professional development might take a more bespoke one-to-one coaching approach. And this cycle really supports that approach to professional development conversations and takes you through this staged process of how to move practice on and develop practitioners and educators using this cycle. So again, all of these resources can be found on the EEF website. This can be found on the Early Years Professional Development Guide website. Many of you will be familiar with the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and this is just really an update of what that is currently telling us about the best available evidence for impactful approaches. So at the moment, and this has been like this for a while, the research evidence tells us that metacognition approaches that improve metacognition and self-regulation of pupils has a high impact and has a very secure and robust evidence base and has a low cost associated with that. Similarly, strategies that improve reading comprehension, again, impactful, or the potential to be impactful. It's worth remembering that research evidence only tells us something that has happened before and elsewhere, doesn't give us any guarantees that these things will work in our schools and in our settings. But you can see there through the padlocks that we can have, we can take some best bets here. It gives us a best bet of the chances that something will work if applied in the intended way. So reading comprehension strategies and then oral language interventions as well. So those practices, there is evidence across all key stages. It's worth looking underneath the surface there, going into each of those toolkit strands individually, looking at the spread of evidence, the phases that they come from, the subjects that the evidence base comes from, and also the guidance for implementation, how it can be implemented in your setting. So if you are considering priorities for next year and you think that one of your school improvement priorities might be linked to one of these toolkit strands, I would encourage you to have a look at the toolkit, look at each of these approaches in a little bit more detail and look at the guidance around implementation. You may also want to look at the programmes that are available for schools as well. So we know that when schools are looking at embedding approaches and improving approaches, they often look to published programmes to support with embedding that practice. So the EEF Promising Programmes allows us to see those programmes that have been evaluated by the EEF through a robust evaluation process, and they have shown promise of leading to improved outcomes for pupils, so have promising results on the attainment for pupils. And you can see here 3 of those that link really directly to the toolkit strands. So dialogic teaching is about oral intervention strategies. Formative assessment is linked to metacognition and self-regulation and feedback, obviously, and reciprocal reading is a reading comprehension strategy. So all of those, again, have a really good evidence base, are showing really good promise at this point, really good promise at this point. So if you were looking to a programme, this is a really good place to start, and that's the EEF Promising Programmes page. I also wanted to share with you some early impact data that has been released for some new programmes. So this one is at efficacy level, and that means that this is now being trialled to see how it could work in schools under the best conditions, really. So it tests out how this programme can be used in schools. This particular one is aimed at improving maths and science attainment in Year 3 and Year 5 pupils. It's a computer assisted programme, and the aim of this is to support pupils to inhibit their natural, intuitive initial responses to questions, and to train them to stop and to provide more slower and reflective responses to questions. So as you can see by the title, challenging that kind of counterintuitive response. Again, as you can see there from the initial findings, that there is promise of impact. You can see the sample size there is quite large at this point, 89 schools, 6,000 pupils, over a 4-month trial period. So again, if that's something that you're interested in, it has a less secure evidence base than some of the others at this point because it's just at that efficacy level, but it is definitely worth some consideration. The other one I wanted to share with you was Fluency Focus. Again, if you're looking at reading programmes in your school, this is a programme that was designed by a research school alongside the EEF Early Programme Development Team. And this was a pilot, so a smaller sample, but focused on reading comprehension for Year 5 pupils. The pilot took place in 20 schools. Again, more information on the EEF website, but just to kind of make you aware of this, really, that this is now being scaled up into a randomised control trial to look at the impact on attainment. So some really exciting projects in the pipeline that are worth keeping your eye out. The other thing I wanted to share with you is this using research evidence guide. This has been around now for quite a few months, But I think it's useful to share at this point if you're planning ahead for next year and thinking about that evidence-informed culture, or you're thinking about professional development or developing approaches in your schools. So there is obviously value in building research evidence, building research evidence literacy among staff in schools. And this guidance provides some resources to support with that. So you can see here just an example of the document about how to use evidence, what we understand the difference between research evidence, school-based data and other sources of information, and what we can take from those sources of evidence. There is a document in there that helps you understand how reliable the claims are that sources of evidence might make. So it's just about upskilling staff on that research literacy, evidence literacy. So if you have a team in your school that are developing evidence-informed approaches or developing that evidence literacy, this is a really useful resource. Finally, this QR code will take you to our newsletter so that you can continue to stay updated with all of the updates from the EEF and the Research School Network. And that includes exemplification materials, blogs, podcasts, resources that bring to life the research evidence. And also just to signpost you towards our YouTube channel, again, where you can find other webinars like this, where you can find some recordings from our podcasts and other resources that we are sharing. So please do have a look at that as well. I hope that's been useful. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at Manchester Communication Research School if we can be of any assistance. And I wish you all a very happy summer term.